Happy Wealth Wednesday. Camilla, I'm so excited to have you here to talk about your journey in research and then also your personal journey of building this, real estate investment property that is super, super exciting and came from some of the inspiration in Eve's Circle. So do you remember what your first investment was and like who got you started?
So I believe my first financial investment was actually in stocks. But in all honesty, I didn't really start investing until many of my friends did, just because I wasn't in a position to invest for some time. I think my first introduction to that was actually prior to when I even would have been able to start investing. And it was when I was in sixth grade. I had a math teacher who was awesome, and she actually designed and structured our whole curriculum for the year around the stock market. So it was insane. So we were like learning the core concepts that you learn in sixth grade, but alongside of that, she grouped us into small groups and she would have us research and track stocks and develop fake portfolios and everything. And we would have to report on that like on a weekly basis. And the whole thing like blew my mind because I didn't really understand what stocks were before, but then even though it was like this make-believe world, I was so in tune with this and having all these conversations with my dad about like different stocks that I was like trying to convince my parents to invest in on my behalf. And I think that really, it made me really excited about this whole other, space that I wasn't familiar with, but it also helps me develop a solid understanding of how stocks work when I would be in a position to actually invest.
Do you remember her name?
Miss Callahan.
Miss Callahan, shout outs wherever you are. If you're watching this, pretty amazing. So cool. So like then from there, I'd love to talk about how and why you got into your space.
My parents are both from outside of the United States, in the Caribbean as well as the Middle East, and our family is just all over. I was very fortunate enough in that my dad worked in aviation, so we had like this way to stay connected to people and any opportunity that we would have to go and see friends and family members, we would take. And my parents, to this day, I don't really understand how they did it. They're like geniuses, but if we were in a place for longer than 3 weeks, they somehow would get me into a school wherever my cousins or our friends would be if school was still in session. And so they were kind of setting me up in these environments where I was getting to just learn firsthand about different cultures. But once I went to into undergraduate and realized like, wow, this is actually a thing that I can like study, I realized that it was my superpower, and it was something that I was just very naturally motivated to continue on studying more formally in academia. And then by the time I completed my doctoral studies, trying to see if I could actually bring that to an applied setting. And so what made me really excited about being in the tech space with my superpower is that it's a lot of these questions are really the foundation that companies should be thinking about and what they should be building from, of like, what are those core needs? But also just thinking about how technology brings us together. It's also bringing together from different cultures, from different linguistic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds together as well. So like trying to really uncover and unfold
this perspective that you bring on cross-culture integration, like what that could mean in the wealth space, I think is fascinating. So, I mean, I would love to ask, what role do you feel you play in the wealth space today? And, or even touching on that, like, what are those opportunities you see for what the future might look like?
So I would say that I know my day-to-day job isn't anchored in the wealth space, but I do still see myself playing a key role in the circles within the wealth space where I am, in just being the ever curious inquirer and like the person that's kind of pushing people to think in different ways, which is probably an expected response from someone who's a researcher. But I think one of my strengths is really taking complex concepts and distilling them down into really digestible frameworks and steps. So I really excel at like identifying unique use cases or unique avenues for maybe investigating or breaking down what the steps might be to make it more achievable for whoever is interested in pursuing maybe a financial pursuit. So in that way, I see like maybe even just making information more accessible to people who might not necessarily have as much access to this information, but also to encourage people to think of maybe opportunities that they're not seeing by making them ask questions like, well, what if X was actually the case? Or how would this work if you actually wanted to make this investment in a Y type of environment? Which I think can then lead to discovery of like lesser known investment opportunities and discover alternative ways that we might be able to invest. So like, I know even like for when I started my journey and looking into ways to invest in real estate, the alternative ways is actually how I started. And it was through there that I was discovering so many different ways of investing internationally, like the Golden Visa programs, or even just like one example is, which is more specific to France, is like the Viagère system, which is where a buyer can make a down payment and then pay a series of payments for an individual who might be older and closer to retirement, and they're paying for them to stay there as long as they're continuing, their life in that home, and then they inherit that home.
So I'd love to know, in that process, especially, like, what do you think has been the most exciting thing you've learned that you would want others to know?
I think one of the most exciting things for me that I learned through that process was how fulfilling and empowering it could be to make an investment that really aligns with my personal values and needs. I know that alongside of just maybe not being at a point in my life earlier on where I was ready or able to make an investment, I think one of the things that was holding me back was just really not knowing where to start. And the researcher in me wanting to do research on everything. So, recognizing that I could be investing in crypto or NFTs to start and then just kind of getting overwhelmed. But once I was able to identify that the right investment for me at this particular time is something that is very closely tied to my family, which is the thing that is most important to me always, then it made it very easy for me to kind of like unlock what I needed to do. And don't get me wrong, there were moments where I was like, definitely letting doubt seep in where I'm like, wait, should I actually be doing something else? Is this the right choice? But I would very quickly return back to like, nope, this is the right thing. This is not just for me. This is for my family. This is for future generations of my family. And that I think was really exciting to see because I really wasn't sure what was going to like unfold once I actually started the journey, but I realized that I had that consistent feeling throughout, which was carrying me through. So I started just more generally like, well, yeah, I want to invest in a property. It could be international. That in part was also informed by like an ongoing joke that my parents have with me, where like whenever people are like, where do you want to live? I always start saying places that are abroad, and they're like, is that your second home or your third home? And I'm like, in this fictitious world, I'm doing really well for myself. Like, I don't know which one is the first or the second. We'll see. But ultimately, I ended up really putting my investment towards a property where my father's side of the family is actually from, and so it's just really exciting because through doing this and through making this investment, then it's almost kind of like we're creating a way for our family to consistently go home. And for, my family that I'll be creating, my sister's family, et cetera, my parents now as well, just to be able to enjoy this time back in the Caribbean.
I mean, I'd love to know, like, is there a person or a company that's really inspiring you in your own personal finance journey or just like wealth and values, and why?
I think the people that have inspired me the most are my parents, and that like they've made not only investments in my sister, myself, the rest of our family, but in like a series of businesses. They've been really great with like diversification of investments, and they're the first people that I would think of. But I just wanted to return back to something that you said about like this being an idea that came 6 months ago. I actually don't think that I would have gotten to this space if it wasn't for Eve Wealth, because and I'm like being 150% honest here, because I just didn't have the time or the space or like the community to really like actually think through what I had been wanting to do. But it really was just like the structure of the Eve circles, and then also knowing that like this was a topic that other people were interested in talking about, really motivated me so much to actually like make progress. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, because I feel like if I hadn't been invited to be a part of an Eve circle 6 months ago, this would probably still be in like the idea phase where it's alongside of the like 16 other properties that I would like to have in different parts of the world.
Same, me too. Let's put a fund on that. But thank you for sharing that. It really means a lot to like the community, and it takes like all of these different faces and perspectives and goals, and yeah, just that accountability to take the step into action. Because
Yeah.
I know you're a researcher, and like even me personally, I find sometimes I can stay a lot in ideation phase, and sometimes it just takes a village to get get to that next
Exactly.
step. And so, I mean, that's great. Kind of to this next question, which is like, what advice would you give to somebody getting started?
I think for someone getting started, trying to find, even if it's just one person or maybe a few people to start talking your ideas with, but people who, I think expanding your perspective of who those people might be, because I think part of why I was stuck for a while was that in my most immediate purview, like the people that I was hearing that were talking about real estate investments, they might have been close friends, but they were talking about it in a very different way. They were looking to where it is that they're interested in investing in like starting their home. Whereas for me, like I, in traveling so much all over the place, kept very anxious sometimes just talking about where it is that I'm going to invest in setting up a home. I like joke that I'm like a roaming home buddy. Like I feel at home in so many different places. And so that made it really hard for me to actually start talking things through. But why I think that the Eve Circle was really compelling and like a great push for me was that I was entering a space where I knew that people were interested just in talking about these topics more generally, and it wasn't necessarily speaking from a specific like vantage point or like for a specific purpose. So I think just finding some people or even connecting with friends to see if they might help you find someone to talk about these ideas that you might have for investments is really critical, because for me that was the biggest hurdle for actually starting to do anything. But once I started to actually say things out loud, then I would put those things that I said out loud on paper. And once I put those things on paper, then I can put them into my like many Excel sheets of things that I needed to do. And then it became much easier for me to break it down into concrete steps that I was going to take to get me closer to my goal.
So awesome. I would love to share too, like, is there any way we can kind of follow your journey and the things that you're doing both in like the startup accelerator world and any like thought leadership you share on this like cultural convergence? Would love to keep in touch and follow.
Yeah, so I don't have, I mean, on my LinkedIn, I do have actually a talk that I gave at a previous uh, F8 conference where I was highlighting like the importance of intercultural communication. So I would definitely like recommend checking that out. It'll give you more perspective on how it is that I think about the importance of intercultural communication. Um, Outside of that, this is actually now a steer or a push for me to be more to be sharing more things. But yeah, I think LinkedIn or my Instagram, but I think that's a little more personal, which is just at Cami.
Amazing. Okay, well, we'll definitely link the LinkedIn. And so if you're like a startup founder and looking for that connect, that they can connect with you that way. And we'll
Yeah.
definitely link the video to the talk as well. Because I know I personally am just so excited to dive into what this looks like and to, also to continue to chat with you about what that intersection of different cultures and personas and beliefs can look like in the finance world, especially as we
Yeah.
build more feminine financial systems that, traditionally just haven't been the focus. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And I feel like it's such an interesting space too, because it's like in some cultures, I think some notions that we might have of how it is that we can build wealth or are so different than in other cultures, or even just in terms like like a very base level in terms of what credit means and how comfortable it is for people to be engaging in forms of credit or versus other ways that people might be organizing their finances.
thank you so much for sharing your story, and definitely looking forward to hopefully more content from you
Yes.
in the future.
Yes. Thank you for having
Thanks
me.
so much.